Hey guys, Patrick R with TFB TV, and I am still here in Austria, and we're going to take a look at Kahles. Joseph, thanks so much for having us here at Kahles. We can't wait to see how you guys are making these scopes, because you guys are one of the only manufacturers in the world that do both right and left-handed scopes. So I'm really excited to see it out, see how you guys build them, and you want to get to it?
Sure, Patrick, sure. You're very
wonderful.
welcome. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Let's go.
All right guys, so we're inside of Kahles, and they kind of gave us a rundown about the building. They started building in 2011, and they asked each one of their 50 employees what they wanted to work the best possible way they could and produce the best optic they could. So they broke ground again in 2011, and in 2012 they opened the facility. They had a 5-minute walk previously at the old facility, all 50 employees did, and they've now make an hour-and-a-half commute, some of them do. They kept every single employee, which I think really speaks to what Kahles is about. And I can see why Ritter Stark has kind of used the Kahles scope on the SX1 as well as the new SLX rifles, because it really does fit with Ritter Stark's mentality as well as Kahles, and I feel it's very Austrian. So let's kind of get after it and see what else I've got. All right, so our first stop on the Kahles factory tour is the metal storeroom, because this tube right here, well, this piece of bar stock that I'm holding in my hand, will probably end up turning into one of their 1 to 6 scopes. So they keep it in a temperature controlled area, and they do that so that the metal doesn't deform, and they don't get any strange waves in the metal, because they told me they are working with a tolerance of like 1 micron, which is really precise. So it goes from what you see behind me, these long tubes, down to something about this size, where they cut it to the size necessary to be machined into the scope body. And they go from here to a de-stressing process that they kind of explained, but I don't fully understand, so I'm not going to lie to you about it. But the idea being to produce the most consistent stock that they can start the machine process with that they possibly can. And again, it's a very Austrian way of thinking about things. So let's continue on to the next step. All right, so now that we've seen the metal storeroom, we're over here at the first milling process, and that's where they take this piece of bar stock, chuck it in this 5-axis CNC machine, and in 2 processes, they mill it down to the scope body that we know. So the first step looks like this, and then it's not handled by anybody, it just kind of goes, it gets turned into this, which will end up being a 1 to 6 that frankly, I think it's just a beautiful piece of machine work. Okay, so the machine behind me here is going to take bar stock and machine bar stock into this part here. Now they tell me that if you hold this piece in your hand for a few minutes like this, that it'll change the dimensions of the aluminum so much so that when they go to cut this slot here, that it'll create issues later when the scope's assembled and cause binding issues later on. So temperature control and providing like a nice place to keep the material as well as working is very important. As like I said, if that slot is even a micron off, they tell me that it could cause serious issues with the scope down the line. All right, so now in this part of the process, this parallax knob, for example, is very shiny, and they want to make sure that it's got a nice uniform finish for when they anodize it later. So what they're going to do is stick it in this media blaster behind me, and they end up with this finish here, which Kahles spent a lot of time perfecting. And the cool thing about it, and what people don't really realize, is it offers a little bit of a adhesion between the rings and the scope body. So maybe if your rings aren't exactly perfectly tight, a Kahles scope might stay in place, whereas maybe other ones might slip a little bit. They did this because in Europe, a lot of the gunsmiths are using glues and things of that nature to put the scope into the rings on the rifle, because they don't really use Americanized scope rings like we would think. Now, in the States, we're just using a clamping force, whereas, like I said, they're using a glue here in Europe. And with this surface that Kahles has developed, it's not really necessary to use the glue, according to them, which is pretty cool, I think. So after this, it goes from this step, after it runs in this giant machine, to anodization, and then, kind of get a more finished looking product.
Now, Kahles does all of their engraving in-house with a specialized machine that cuts a unique letter shape into the ocular piece, or the elevation and windage adjustment knobs, or even that parallax adjustment knob. They all get this specialized care. And it's not quite like the letters that you find in that trophy you got at last year's Christmas party for being the dumbest employee in the office, or the tryout cheerleading trophy that your son got. But these have kind of a shape to them that allows that letter to appear sharp and clear. And you can kind of see how beautiful that engraving is.
All right, so it's reasonably dark in here and pretty quiet because these employees behind me are focusing on their job very, very closely, because they're taking all those parts that we see made out there, putting into this little tube, and this one's capped off because it's complete. But it's super, super delicate work, and you see them wearing a lab coat, and obviously have joined Team Kahles, because dust and contaminants and things of that nature are very dangerous to the optic process. If any dust gets in here, it's amplified by the lenses, and the scope would be ruined for the consumer.
Now you see them taking a great amount of care when they put these scopes together, and he's applying some glue and then removing a little bit of excess and just making sure that everything is 100%. And he looks like a jeweler because it requires that much precision and care, that you would find when you're talking about old world watchmakers. And now that he's got this kind of put together, we'll see what goes into making sure that the glass is clear before it gets assembled like this. Now, these scope tubes here have already been pre-assembled and they're pretty much good to go at this point, but before they get to that point, all of the pieces of glass inside of the tube have to go through this careful cleaning process to make sure that it is a dust, lint, and dirt-free lens. Like I said, a little piece of dust can ruin it.
All right, so we're at the last stage of the process. So they've assembled the scope, they've machined everything, it's cleaned and dust-free, and now it's going to be checked against the target downrange, which I'll show you a picture of it. I can't show you how they have the system set up because it's too cool and they don't want anybody else to steal it. Anyhow, this is a reference scope, so every scope that leaves this factory has to be at least this good. And I'm going to tell you, it's pretty darn good. This machine you see behind me is used to go ahead and simulate any range, well, possible. But they do have presets in 100 and 200 yard or meter increments, from 30 meters all the way out to 800 meters. So you set it in to the cradle here, kind of line it up with the target downrange, well, down across the room rather, and they can check turret tracking and parallax and all that good stuff and make sure it's all perfect and ready for the consumer. And I'm gonna say it's probably one of the coolest final QC checks I've seen yet, and I've seen some pretty cool ones. All right, so we stopped at their little in-house museum to take a look at some of the different models that Kahles has produced over the years. And I've got one of the first ones in my hands that bared the Kahles name on its own, and that is a Migden 4-power scope that was produced in 1908. And the clarity on this isn't really that bad. I mean, the fact that they were able to produce something like this, way over 100 years ago, that is as clear as it is nothing short of amazing. So now, like I said earlier, Kahles is notable because they were one of the first to produce a rifle scope like we think of rifle scopes today. There was another guy, I understand, that was from the US, but it wasn't quite as you would expect. So the box I've got in my hand here is actually the box it would have been delivered in. This is the retail packaging, I guess. But unfortunately, during the Second World War, the original Kahles factory was bombed because obviously there was some disagreements in the region, and they weren't left with much of their company history left. Thankfully, they've been able to piece together scopes and retail packaging and whatever have you, and get kind of an idea as to the progression of the company and where they came from. All right, guys, so that's it for our tour of Kahles. And we can really see the care and precision put into every step of producing the rifle scope. It's quite outstanding, and this attention to detail results in a product that's one of the best in the world. Like I said, they're notable that they were the inventors of the modern rifle scope, which I think is really awesome that they're still in production today. They're still producing some of the best scopes in the world. Well, from the only scope in the world to some of the best. It's a pretty good track record, I think. Anyhow, thanks to our sponsors, ProxyVid and Ventura Munitions. Check them out down in the description, and we'll see you guys later. Bye.